I'm going to start by talking about transportation issues, and I just wanted to remind folks again that with each of the activities that we've been doing in the planning process so far, we're starting with a high-level principle. And you remember the big sheet of high-level planning principles at the back of the room, which you now have in your book as well. When we think about transportation planning in Grandview-Woodland, we're talking about the idea of providing and supporting a range of sustainable transportation options. That's kind of the starting point, the big premise there. Which takes things like the Transportation 2040 plan and tries to scale it down to the neighborhood. So what we did, I'm just going to talk about the objectives this time, not the specific emerging policies there, but we divided them by modes, very similar to the Transportation 2040 document. Objective number one was enhancing and maintaining a well-developed pedestrian network. That meant everything from supporting greenways to wider sidewalks to the sort of pedestrian support systems like public art, seats, urban street trees and urban tree canopy to provide a more comfortable and delightful walking experience there for folks. There are 6 directions there. They're on page 6, so you can follow along and see what specifically they refer to. The next one was looking at cycling, and how we chose to do that in the Grandview-Woodland emerging directions was to have a high-level objective of improving and expanding the existing cycling network. And you'll know from the conversation so far today that there's been lots of discussion around that. We had a number of directions there, 5 specific policy ideas that were proposed, and a number of different routes that were identified for these. And I'll tell you a little bit about the areas that had enhanced discussion around them. On the transit side, big issue there. Transportation and transit in particular is something that the city only has really a bit of an advocacy stake in. For the most part, it is TransLink and the province that really drives the transit discussions in the neighborhood. Nevertheless, the city works with TransLink quite closely around transit discussions, and our proposal there was really to look at enhancing the transit service that exists, bus service east and west along Broadway, north and south on Commercial and in other areas of the neighborhood as well. Finally, motor vehicles. The objective here, and this covers again to Lisa's point, cars, but also goods movement as well. The objective with the motor vehicle component of the plan was to ensure safe and efficient use of the road network in Grandview-Woodland, to support a gradual reduction in car dependence by making it easier to drive less, and to support goods and services movement and delivery. And there was a series of 4 directions around that, looking at questions of parking and how that played out in the neighborhood, looking at loading and deliveries and how that integrated with the high streets and the commercial areas there, and also better managing the parking permit process at the residential level. So against these directions, these objectives, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the areas of feedback, or the feedback that we received from folks. I would say by and large, our transportation discussions or directions were for the most part supported. A lot of people like them in general. They like the idea of improved transportation options in the neighborhood, but there were specific things that stood out for folks. So the idea of pedestrian goals and making a better and more lively pedestrian environment, yes, people like that. They did, however, zero in on the idea that traffic calming should be drawn out more explicitly in the planning process. There was support for bike infrastructure overall, but very definite mixed opinions about how that played out, in particular on Commercial Drive and also on Victoria Drive. So lots of disagreement about whether or not one was better than the other, or whether or not either should be considered, what particular types of bike lane we were talking about, where it started, where it ended, lots of conversation there. There was general support for transit improvements and increased capacity for public transit, but when it came to Broadway, the question of what exactly that meant, subway, light rapid transit, bus improvements, things like that, that was a particular point of discussion there. And also the question of Commercial Drive and the idea of rapid bus service or rapid transit, anything like that on the drive also came up. One of the surprising pieces that came out of our emerging directions feedback was the fact that East First, which had been identified throughout the planning process as an area people wanted us to look at more closely, was in fact something that caused a bit of concern, the idea of a bus shuttle on there. And two of the big issues there, really the idea that when you link transportation and land use, the concern was that more people coming into the neighborhood might in fact exacerbate challenges around the station area, increase crowding where there's already a pretty crowded facility there. There was concerns about loss of parking for similar reasons and the impact that new development would have on parking situations. I guess last but not least, in general, lots of high-level support for the environmental dimensions of improved sustainable transportation options. I've just been told I have 2 minutes left to talk about local economy. So small issues of taxation and leasing and stuff like that. The big principle, foster a robust, resilient economy. That's our full stop planning principle there. What that means in terms of high streets was to support Grandview-Woodland's high streets, the independent, eclectic nature of them, and to supplement the support with opportunities for growth. And there were two emerging directions around this. You remember the commercial drive direction that I talked about on the first day was the idea of very specific areas on the drive that would be allowed for additional height and density, but that the majority of the drive was going to be kept at its prevailing zoning right now. Pardon me. The other piece about Hastings Street, which I don't have an image of there, was that Hastings Street was going to be divided into three distinct areas. The commercial area there, where you have Patricia's smaller local independent businesses, the area on the slope where you start to get into mixed-use industrial area, and then the area west of the drive to Clark. I have no minutes left, apparently, which was currently the site of car dealerships, the new no-frills and aspects of economic development such as that. Commercial nodes, these were the smaller commercial nodes like the one down at Dundas and Wall on the Nanaimo Street. One of the objectives we had was to allow for expansion and enhancement of these, to improve the types of service offerings that were available in there, to introduce a mixed-use residential component. Neighborhood retail, the smaller scale stuff off the main streets, the very fine-grained stuff that you see within the neighborhood. We had an objective to maintain that where it existed and to support it, because a lot of these little corner stores, the mom-and-pop shops, have some real challenges. If you look at the historical fabric of the neighborhood, a whole bunch of them have disappeared over the last 4 or 5 decades, but people really like them. And if you think about the idea of a very walkable neighborhood, certainly these play an important role. Manufacturing and light industrial, a comment there. We are very, very serious about maintaining the light industrial and heavy manufacturing space that we have in the city. And so one of the explicit no-go areas in our planning process is that we're not going to allow residential in this. This has to be maintained as job space. And so we take Patricia's concerns that were raised very seriously about that, and I can talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Art and food. We had a particular objective in our planning process that really wanted to highlight the role that Grandview-Woodland's industrial areas play both in the cultural economy, much like the space that we're in right now. There's a lot of cultural facilities that are buried, hidden away in the industrial areas, and also the food economy, particularly down in the north end. We all talk about local food. It's not just about markets and food carts. There's some very significant food production places down there. And they play a really critical role in supporting the city's goals around cultural economy and food economy, and so we want to call those out. Objective number 6, the last one on the local economy side, was connected with the port, and that was simply one direction that said we continue to support the port's role in the local, provincial, and federal economies. It plays a very significant role there, and we want to make sure that the plan supports that. Against these 6 objective areas, very quickly the feedback we got, Patricia alluded to this earlier, concerns about rent and lease control. That was a big issue, and particularly so because when the plan came out, or the emerging directions rather, Little Nest was in the news a lot, Prop House, places that had had their leases get very, very high very quickly and were thus displaced from that. And so the concern around, can the city do something about that, top of mind for folks? The short answer is that's a real challenge for us because that's not something within the city's jurisdiction, lease control there. The question of taxes came up, but certainly in the directions feedback that we got, it was leasing that was the big topic of concern. Support for maintaining the independent character. There were concern about chain stores that were mentioned a lot in the feedback. Lots of impact about the, lots of concern about the impact of new development and people on businesses. And I'll just say that the feedback was mixed. A lot of people were under the impression that more people coming into the neighborhood would negatively affect the local businesses. A lot of people said, oh, that's going to be great for my business because I'm going to have more people in there. So there was a real divergence about how people viewed new folks coming into the neighborhood and what that would do to the current state of business. There were lots of discussions around the look and beautification of commercial sites, industrial sites, the heritage component of them, the public realm and streetscape dimensions of these spaces, things that we could do to improve those. A lot of these you find in the specific sub-area directions that are also in the back of the emerging directions document. Building form and height, that came up quite a lot on Commercial Drive. I've mentioned that in the last few presentations I've given. At the Kettle site, the social housing and supportive housing facility down in Venables, the eastern portion of Hastings. So to Patricia's point, yes, lots of feedback around the 8-story stuff on Hastings Street there and the role that that might have. A lot less concern, I'll say, around higher buildings west of the drive on Hastings Street. What do you have down there? Yes, maybe the 600-foot car lot is an independent business, but people were less concerned about whether or not growth could or could not go there. Hastings Street in that particular juncture has always been seen in the planning process as an opportunity area for dealing with growth and development in the neighborhood. General support for directions around the industrial arts, the industrial areas, the arts, the food economy, the Port Metro Vancouver. Some questions about adjacency issues, smell, noise, things like that, and how that related. And putting residential right next to heavy manufacturing has never been an intent in the plan. There was always the idea of buffering that to try and mitigate some of those concerns where possible. And then lastly, there was some discussion in the feedback we got around why aren't roles around office uses in neighborhood planning and future buildings called out a little bit more. So could we spend a bit more time on that? Whew. Overtime.